Okay, so now let's talk about how we're going to resolve the problem that faces crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter year after year. So first, I want to pull up a diagram of the ideal world. So in an ideal world, anyone starting up a project on Kickstarter or Indiegogo will collect some amount of money from some contributors, and all that money gets sent to the ideas person or a product owner here. Great. So now essentially, it is the person who's going to turn the idea into reality. This is the idea person. So in an ideal world, that product manager will take the project and maybe send it off to some vendors. They are not going to build the plastic casings themselves, for example. Maybe this idea person will work with outside vendors to get these basic parts put together, and then the idea person will then assemble those parts into the finished product. So let's imagine that every crowdfunding campaign is a product owner with some number of vendors here. At the end of the day, they are collecting the money for some product or service that they're putting out there to the public, so they have to be spending that money on something. It's not unreasonable to say that all this money that has been collected by the product owner gets spent out there to some outside party. This is the ideal world. This is what we want to have happen. However, as a lot of people fear, the reality is a bit different. There are many successful Kickstarter campaigns, but sometimes this is what happens. Not ideal situation. We have contributors, they send in the money, and then unfortunately that money ends up in some private bank account, which instead is going to supply a vacation and a brand new BMW. And yes, this has happened. There was a show that I watched a few months ago where a guy, it was a show about, murder cases, and this guy was arrested for murder. And this guy had a GoFundMe campaign where he raised $50,000 for himself because he supposedly was terminally ill, and he had all these awful pictures of him on the GoFundMe campaign of his, bedridden with gas masks coming out of his mouth and everything. And this guy successfully raised $50,000 for himself and spent that money lavishly on himself, and even had time to go and murder someone as well. Great. Again, that pisses me off. I tried unsuccessfully to fund new business ventures on Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and GoFundMe. But yet this guy did the traditional pity party and raised 50 grand for himself, and had enough leisure money to free up time to go murder someone. So never mind, the fact that he also fraudulently collected $50,000, which I believe GoFundMe is somehow now trying to get back. So this is not ideal. We do not want this kind of thing to happen. So what is the common denominator, or what is the difference between not ideal and ideal? Well, it appears the big difference in both situations is where this money goes. If we could somehow control this money not being sent to a private bank account, right? But instead, we want to, instead it'll be sent to some vendor who will provide the materials to build some product. Then it seems to me like we would have a more successful product or campaign on our hands. So that will be the exact goal of the smart contract that I'm going to design. I'm going to build a contract that's going to try to control where this idea person can send money to. So let's walk through this contract and see exactly how it's going to be put together. So now we're ready for this diagram. So at a low level, the contributors have some amount of code that regulates who can receive money from the campaign. So we can think of this contract as representing the actual campaign. It's like a public display of all expenses and funding of the campaign. So how does money get actually taken out of this thing? How does the manager actually work with an Ethereum contract and make use of the money that's inside the contract and use it? And we also want the product owner to pay vendors, because that's probably going to lead to a successful campaign, right? Are we ready for this? Okay, so in the contract, they're going to call a function that creates a spending request. A spending request is going to attempt to withdraw money from the contract and send it to some specific external address. And in this case, the external address is some vendor. So this vendor is the one who will make the LCD display or develop the sensors for the product, whatever. Someone who is going to help us further the campaign along and can be proved that they will build the product and not run away with all the money. Now, this of course is now getting more specific to Kickstarter or Indiegogo, but doesn't really apply to GoFundMe because that platform is more like, hey, I need money to get me out of this situation, and so that's a whole. It's different in that aspect. Anyway, here's where the Ethereum stuff starts to come into play for the Kickstarter and Indiegogo situations. In those type of platforms, and this is going to more apply to that kind of a platform, what we're going to say is that the manager has the responsibility to create a spending request to pay an outside vendor. But here's the interesting part. We're going to say that all the people who contributed to the campaign have to vote on every spending request made. Every spending request made by the product manager. So each of these contributors have to call a function to approve the spending request. If enough people approve the spending request, then the funds get automatically sent to the outside vendor, and in theory, that vendor will now deliver some supplies to deliver on the product. However, if the majority of contributors vote no, then that is an indication that this is a bad request and that the manager is mismanaging the campaign in some fashion, and they need to get their act together. Otherwise, these contributors are not going to approve the spending request. So this also assumes wisdom of the crowds, similar to how these crowdfunding sites assume wisdom of the crowds, or maybe they could just, could care less about the wisdom of the crowds. Maybe they just want the platform to be successful and popular, and it makes sense because some really horrible campaigns have been funded. Some awesome campaigns have not been funded, and some straight up scams have been funded. But in this case, we're going to also assume the wisdom of the crowds to see that unlike Kickstarter in its present state, in this platform that I'm going to build, they're going to have, the contributors will have more control over the funds they provide. And this also may lead to real funders getting involved with Kickstarter, a real VC or real angel investor, real funder, as I call it. And a real funder is not just going to donate some money and whatever happens, happens. That's how it is in its present state. So it's really not, they're really not investors. They're really just donations. They're just pledges. They're not investments. So what I'm doing is I'm developing a smart contract where it's going to be investors. The contributors are going to be more like investors. That's going to be the actual model, not donations, but more like investments. It's like when you, the way it is now is when you pledge to public broadcasting to help them keep the lights on, they're going to offer whatever programming they feel like it still, and you're just literally giving away money for a free mug or t-shirt, but whatever programming they want to put on, that's what they'll do. But in this model that I'm offering with the Ethereum smart contract, you will be a true stakeholder in that you will have control over your donation or your investment, control over how it's spent, every single dime of it. Obviously, this might have a couple of holes in it. For example, whether or not the contributors will bother even voting yes or no, which perhaps the lack of votes may kind of just put an unnecessary hamper on the product creation process. So we're also assuming that the manager is not going to try to trick the contributors into sending the money to a fraudulent vendor. At the end of the day, this approach goes a lot further to producing successful campaigns in the real world than the current Kickstarter system. The current crowdfunding system says, okay, product manager, you won, here's your money. Go and do the right thing, and there's no control whatsoever on what happens to that money on the part of the contributors of that money. They submit their donation and wave goodbye to their money forever. With the type of approach that I'm offering by using an Ethereum contract, at least these contributors have an idea of where this money is going to be sent to, and they have the ability to review these spending requests before the money gets spent. So again, maybe it's not the perfect solution in the world, but it gives a lot more power to contributors than they would otherwise have. And that's it. That's the solution using an Ethereum contract. Great. So now the fun part starts. I'm going to actually go ahead and build this system. I'm going to build the functionality of it in Ethereum, and then I'm going to build a fantastic looking front end application to sit in front of all this. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a system that approximates how a crowdfunding platform like Kickstarter behaves, but without the scams. All right. So see you soon.